2024. My name is Daniel Rothenberg. I co-direct the Future Security Initiative with my colleague Peter Bergen. We are a partnership between ASU and New America, a DC-based think tank. And we're working on different ways to creatively understand security challenges in a holistic manner. So not the traditional way to engage security issues, but sort of a broader way. And we're really thrilled to have our guest tonight, Jonathan Blitzer, who's written a really extraordinary book. Everyone Who Is Gone Is Here, the United States, Central America, and the Making of a Crisis. This event is co-sponsored by a number of our excellent colleagues here at ASU, the Center for Latinas American Political Research, that's CLAPPER, which fosters and supports thoughtful, objective, innovative research on the political and policy circumstances of the nation's Latina and Latino Hispanic population, thereby creating a fuller, deeper understanding of politics and governance in the United States. Also, the Hispanic Research Center, HRC, which was created in 1985. It's a university-wide interdisciplinary research unit and a hub for transformative education. And it was administratively housed in the college and conducts basic and applied research on a broad range of topics related to Latino and Hispanic populations. And finally, our other co-sponsor is the School for Social Transformation, in which undergraduate and graduate students become globally informed leaders in community engagement, research advancement, and continued efforts to break down barriers by learning about the historical, cultural, and social forces that shape our society and finding innovative ways to positively transform the world. As you can see for all these co-sponsors, there's a lot of engagement with Latinx issues here in Arizona, no great surprise. And John, we're thrilled to have you here. Your book deals with these issues in a very impressive way. And just a quick introduction before we go on. John was an Emerson Collective Fellow, that is one of the selected National New America Fellows. Our FSI supports several of those fellows, and you've heard from them if you've come to other of our events. He's a staff writer at The New Yorker. His book was named as one of the top books of 2024 so far by the New York Times. And the book is about the history of regional migration to the United States from the 1980s to the present. It actually goes back even a little farther than that. And John is the recipient of an Edward R. Murrow Award, a National Award for Education Reporting. He received the Immigration Journalism Prize from the French American Foundation, as well as a Media Leadership Award from the American Immigration Lawyers Association, which is one of the main immigration lawyers entities here in the US that's worked on these issues for many years. So John, welcome. That's a lot of talk to introduce you. We're thrilled to have you here. And I thought I'd just start our conversation, which will be followed by Q&A, and we'll have those of you in the audience who want to ask questions for John, please just put them into the Q&A section when we get to that part of the evening. So let's just start with the pressing question. You've written a book about immigration. Is there an immigration crisis at the southern border? And if so, how would you describe that?
Yeah, it's a good question to start with. And first of all, thank you so much for having me. It's an honor to be here. You know, that phrase, as you know, and as is implied by the question, is so loaded. And it's sort of an immigration reporter's nightmare of a framing, because it has a lot of sort of partisan spin and I think bad faith built into how this issue gets sold and talked about publicly. So, you know, in a certain sense, I'm very skeptical to call what's happened at the southern border an immigration crisis. First of all, if we were to call it a crisis of any sort, it would, I think, probably best be described as an asylum crisis. One of the frustrating facts of covering these issues in the United States, as you well know, is that the kind of border overtakes every other aspect of the immigration system. And so, you know, I wince anytime the phrase immigration crisis is used, because it's just another example of how perceptions of chaos at the border overshadow the fact that the wider system is in, I think, a different sort of crisis insofar as it needs to be updated, reformed, expanded, and hasn't been in any sense since 1990. That said, I do think it is fair to say that there has been and remains a kind of emergency at the southern border. And the way I would define it is as saying essentially that over the last decade plus, there has been a very acute policy problem with very distinct political consequences at the southern border in the form of larger numbers of people seeking asylum or protection at the southern border than the U.S. government can administratively manage. And so there is a real conundrum here. And so far, nothing of what we've seen from either party, and I think it's fair to say at this point that the Republican approach is essentially to crack down on asylum, which is a bedrock legal principle, which I think needs to be defended for all kinds of reasons. And the Democrats have kind of agonized over trying to pay lip service to the ideals of asylum, but nevertheless wanting to run from the political consequences of there being disorder at the border. And what we've seen over the last few years is a real attempt to limit the ability of people to avail themselves of a fundamental right, which is to seek protection at the southern border. I do think that that's a crisis. I think, right now, the numbers of arrivals at the southern border are lower than they have been in several years. One is always wary of making broad extrapolations based on the numbers of arrivals at any given moment, because this is a global phenomenon. These things can change on a dime. But for example, at the start of this year, the numbers were so high that there really was a sense, both generalized and very acute, of authorities being overwhelmed at the southern border. And I would add just to this general appraisal the fact that, it's a crisis for people who are fleeing for their lives, who have, left their home countries because they have no choice, and who come north to the United States for any number of reasons: protection, opportunity, family reunification, and there aren't channels for them to pursue any of those options. And so, as far as I'm concerned, it remains a crisis because there has not been any policy solution, and the politics on it have just gotten uglier and uglier.
So this is a great way to get to the story of your book, because your book is really about a particular history. And maybe you could, for everybody who's participating, give like a quick summation of the overall point and the focus. It's not a short book, and it's incredibly rich and detailed in its portraits of the individuals that you profile. But it does have an overall story, and maybe you could just give us like the quick summation.
Yeah, sure. Until the kind of mid 2010s, the general dynamic at the US southern border, the way kind of policymakers tended to understand it, politicians tended to talk about it, was based on the general profile of a border crosser being a single male from Mexico crossing into the United States for work. And so over the years, all through the 80s, the 90s, the early 2000s, the armature of everything that was built up by the US government. And this was really kind of hypercharged by the creation of the Department of Homeland Security after 9/11. Massive budgets for border security and enforcement regimes at the southern border. All of it was focused primarily on a population of people who the US government could actually handle relatively swiftly from a kind of legal and administrative sense. People who could be apprehended and speedily expelled. What started to change, the kind of moment when this really clearly changed, obviously these things are complex and there are all kinds of factors that feed into it, but there was a kind of concrete moment in 2013, 2014, when US authorities were overwhelmed at the southern border. And one of the reasons they were so overwhelmed was the population of people showing up at the southern border had fundamentally changed. And rather than single adults from Mexico crossing for work, you had families and children from Central America, from the so-called Northern Triangle of Central America. So that is El Salvador, Guatemala, Honduras, showing up at the southern border in very large numbers, tens of thousands of people seeking asylum, which the US has had as a kind of enshrined law since 1980, the principle being that anyone who shows up at the US southern border claiming that they're being persecuted in their home country has a legal right to seek protection, and the US government has a legal obligation to extend that protection in the form first of a kind of screening at the southern border, and then eventually a full hearing before an immigration judge. What starts to happen in 2014 is American authorities are totally overwhelmed by the numbers of people showing up. The system, the immigration court system, which had been kind of starved of resources over the years, gets badly backlogged. It fuels all kinds of ugly populist partisan politics. The rise of Donald Trump had a lot to do with the kind of general dynamics of what was perceived at the southern border. And really, for what was essentially the last decade, it started to shift over the last couple of years. Now the population showing that the southern border is much more global. But for the most part, the last decade has seen a really specific problem in which there's this, an exodus from Central America. Huge numbers of people showing up, fleeing the countries of their origin for all kinds of reasons, whether it was gang violence, kind of endemic corruption that made life, miserable in these places, crippling poverty, the consequences of climate change, you name it. And American authorities didn't really have a kind of meaningful or thoroughgoing policy solution, and the politics just got ugly. And so the aim of the book is to understand how we eventually arrived at that moment. And the story, of course, as you can imagine, does not begin anywhere near 2014. To understand how the problems in the region became what they were, and how the asylum system itself was so under-equipped to deal with what was happening, all point back to the 1980s. And two things developed in the 1980s that were in kind of immediate conflict, and in some ways kind of set up the thematic tensions in the book. And that was, on the one hand, you have the creation of refugee and asylum law for the first time in an American statute, and we can talk about this more specifically. This is my thumbnail sketch of the book. I'm trying to whittle it down. So you have the creation of refugee and asylum law in 1980, and at the same time, you have the Cold War raging all over the world, but particularly in Central America. And that meant that the US had allies in the region, in places like El Salvador and Guatemala, where there were brutal military regimes in power that were cracking down on their populations. People from those countries were fleeing. And when they arrived at the US southern border seeking protection under this new law, the US government did not give them that protection, because giving them that protection would mean acknowledging American complicity in the horrors being perpetrated by allies in the Cold War. And so this is the start of a kind of miasma of, geopolitics and US domestic politics that persist all through the 80s, the 90s, the early 2000s, all of which really tie the US and the region tighter and tighter together. And so, at this point, it's sort of more widely known, but when I started working on this book, it maybe wasn't. That, for instance, the now infamous MS-13 street gang. That gang, while it's associated with El Salvador and the wider region in Central America, began on the streets of Los Angeles in the late 1980s. And so the aim of the book is, through human stories, to actually kind of anatomize that broader history, and in effect to profile the relationship between the United States and the wider region, and to show all of the ways in which the so-called crisis at the southern border that erupts in 2014 has, as a kind of background, all of these other factors for which the US is not just to blame, but I think kind of more meaningfully, it needs to reckon with, if it's going to kind of not only make good on its role in the region, but if it's also going to administer immigration policy thoughtfully moving forward.
To get to your point about the particular stories, maybe you could recount in a little detail the tale of Juan Ramagosa, who figures significantly in the book.
Yeah, Juan is, to my mind, the kind of beating heart of the book. Juan was a medical student who went to university in the late 1970s in El Salvador. He's from the southern part of El Salvador, from Usulután. Was a trained surgeon who was engaged in a lot of grassroots activism that was viewed very, very suspiciously and aggressively by the Salvadoran military at the time. So Juan, as a doctor, or as a doctor in training, provided medical care to rural peasants across the country. And at one moment in early 1980, while he was providing just routine medical exams to poor people in the countryside, the Salvadoran National Guard arrives on the scene and starts opening fire onto this population of people who had assembled just to have regular checkups with doctors. Juan is not only shot and badly wounded in the leg, but is taken into custody. and is basically tortured for a period of 3 weeks, hellish torture. And his torturers, who were from the Salvadoran National Guard, which at the time was coordinating very closely with the United States government, both the CIA and the State Department, they basically said to him, you know, our aim here, we're going to incapacitate you. We're going to prevent you from practicing medicine again. So they shot him in the hand. They tried to destroy nerves in his hand so he could never perform surgeries again. Really horrific, kind of unthinkable stuff. He eventually is released. He sort of escapes. He flees the country, and he needs a period of a few years to convalesce in Mexico. And while he's in Mexico, this is now 1980 to 1983, he falls in with a church group that is providing relief to indigenous Guatemalan refugees fleeing a simultaneous civil war in Guatemala. So you have the Salvadoran Civil War raging roughly from 1980 to 1992. And as you know better than I, you have the Guatemalan Civil War raging over an even longer period from the 60s until the mid 90s. And the population that was particularly brutalized there were indigenous peasants, you know, all across the countryside in Guatemala. And so Juan, in the mid 1980s, starts to, on a weekly basis, travel through a church group with Guatemalan refugees who are moving through Mexico to the United States. And once they reach the United States-Mexico border, they are falling in with a kind of burgeoning activist network in the United States known as the Sanctuary Movement, which was primarily a religious-based movement that consisted of tens of thousands of volunteers all across the country. And the idea of this movement was that, you know, its members, who were not necessarily lawyers, who were kind of ordinary people, who were outraged by, you know, kind of American excesses in the Cold War in Latin America, and who felt like the promise of this 1980 Refugee Act was being, you know, kind of ignored and subverted by the Reagan administration. They were essentially helping desperate migrants cross the border. They were more or less smuggling them across the border and beginning to test the kind of parameters of some of these new immigration laws on the books. Juan eventually,
what was the border like then, just to give us a little comparison to the present?
I mean, it's almost impossible to conjure now to anyone who's seen the border as it currently exists. I mean, it was much less heavily trafficked. It was not militarized to the same degree. You know, border patrol agents were kind of few and far between. There wasn't kind of organized smuggling south of the border. It was kind of more mom and pop kind of local operations. So everything was a much smaller scale. It was much more haphazard. And I think it wasn't very hard, frankly, to cross the border undetected at that time. What was hard was to find a way to actually avail yourself of the 1980 Refugee Act. And so some of these activists, seeing the border for what it was, as, you know, essentially a somewhat lightly policed kind of hinterland, took some of the people they were trying to help to local immigration offices. Then it wasn't called Immigration and Customs Enforcement. It wasn't called ICE. It was called the INS, the Immigration and Naturalization Service. And basically, some of these activists, in good faith, and in retrospect, maybe somewhat naively, asked local INS chiefs, okay, you know, what should we do? And these local INS chiefs, depending on kind of what their politics were, what their individual bents were, would say, well, you know, we have asylum laws now on the books. And so, you know, if you believe that your clients, you know, fit the criteria for asylum as it's laid out in the statute, you should bring them in and kind of go through this formal process. And, you know, before long, the activists realized that that process had been hijacked by the State Department, that all of the people they were bringing to the INS were having their claims rejected in mass, just because of where they were coming from, not based on any of the facts of their cases. And this movement, and this is another thing that's kind of hard to imagine now, really commanded broad popular attention all through the 1980s. They were eventually prosecuted, and 11 or 12 of them were indicted in the late 1980s for their involvement in this case. And it's incredible. You go through old INS and Border Patrol records, and you have Border Patrol agents all through the 1980s saying, you know, look, this is a really complicated movement to deal with. You know, we just saw them speaking really kind of persuasively and poignantly on 60 Minutes last night about, you know, the need to help people who are desperate arriving at the southern border. We don't want to make these guys into martyrs. We're losing this kind of public relations battle over the border. So this was very much, you know, this was front page news all through the 1980s, not just what was happening in the region. in places like El Salvador and Honduras and Guatemala. But this activist battle was also playing out. And Juan ends up becoming kind of a key player in this movement on the West Coast initially, in San Francisco primarily, an activist, an outspoken organizer of other Salvadorans and Guatemalans who had recently arrived, but also someone who kind of really embodied the ethos of the sanctuary movement, which was to have, on the one hand, American activists do what they could legally, and then simultaneously to have some of these newly arrived immigrants tell their stories publicly, because it was important for people in the United States to know the broader story of what was happening. And so Juan eventually moves to the East Coast, directs a really storied medical clinic for undocumented immigrants in Washington, D.C., called La Clínica del Pueblo. And a few years later, in the early 2000s, and this is actually where I first found out about Juan, ends up testifying in a civil trial in a court in Florida, involving two Salvadoran ministers of defense who were American allies who had been brought to the United States legally through ties they had to the US State Department and the CIA, who were living as retirees in Florida, but who were implicated in some of these mass atrocities and war crimes committed in El Salvador. And Juan ends up being one of the lead plaintiffs in this human rights trial against these two Salvadoran generals living in Florida, testifies, describes his story. And this begins in 2002. These generals lose this war crimes case in a civil court, and eventually the Department of Homeland Security starts to take an interest in their case and ends up deporting them in 2015 for the commission of war crimes. And so Juan, at kind of every moment in this broader history between the United States and the region, whether it concerns El Salvador, Guatemala, Mexico, the United States, he's sort of there living out this incredible drama firsthand. And so he's really kind of at the core of the broader story.
That was a great retelling of those parts of the book. What do you think? I mean, I would say most Americans now, even, they hear about the border, they hear about immigration crisis, or however you want to understand it. But I feel like there's very little understanding or acknowledgement of the history and the story that you recount in the book, and that you just gave us a taste of. What do you think? It's a complex story, right? It involves engaging a lot of things like the Cold War and US policy in the Americas. What do you think? Is there a way to communicate that background, that history that's so crucial to what's going on now, to sort of the more ordinary person who doesn't, have the time to wade into, complex histories?
Yeah. I thought a lot about this working on the book, and I think a lot about this too in my day job. My response is gonna end up sounding a little kind of naive, but I really am convinced that if people are told a story of actual human drama that involves the full range of human emotions, that doesn't turn a particular immigrant at the center of the story into a hero or a villain, but acknowledges the full range of human complexity running through that person's life and story. And if the story is told in a way that is compelling and that actually takes in what to me is just a profoundly epic drama, I do think it can break a little bit of the lock of what I see as kind of basic, almost routinized preconceptions that people have about the border or the immigration issue. I mean, people in their day-to-day lives hear that this is a problem constantly, incessantly. No one is pitching them on solutions. I mean, it's not people's sort of day-to-day responsibilities to sort of think through complex policy solutions, but people don't want to be sort of lectured about American complicity in, ugly historical realities, in the second half of the 20th century. And they don't have the bandwidth to kind of like be walked through all of the ins and outs of, asylum law or international human rights law. But I do think that people don't grasp how just incredibly suspenseful and stirring the story is when you consider all of the different facets of it. And so, I was very conscious picking the main figures of this book. As you can imagine, over the years, I've met hundreds of people whose stories are fascinating. And I've, in many instances, felt like I could write individual books about any number of them. But I tried to pick people whose stories, almost in their kind of DNA, in the DNA of these people's lives and in their stories, anatomized just how fused together the United States is with the wider region. And so you can't know these people, you can't interact with them, you can't meet them in the world and not in some form or another bump into this history. And these aren't people, Juan is maybe a rare case because he's very politically conscious and very politically minded. He was an activist and so on. But there are other people in the book, and I'm thinking of someone named Eddie Anzora, also Salvadoran, who came to the United States in the early 1980s when he was a child, 3-year-old.
Tell us a little of that story, because yeah, that's it.
I mean, Eddie, to be totally frank, Eddie is the reason I wrote the book. I remember meeting Eddie. So Eddie Anzora came to the United States when he was 3 years old in 1980, with his mother and younger brother. His father was not in the picture. And like so many other Salvadoran refugees at that moment, they wind up in South Central Los Angeles at a time when, tens of thousands of Central Americans are arriving, every month. And the city itself is changing. And, so he arrives in a city where, for the first few years of his life as a child, he didn't realize he was Salvadoran. He sort of thought he was Mexican because he knew a little Spanish based on his conversations with his mom, but his mom didn't speak the way his Mexican friends spoke. The streets of South Central during those years were really defined by sort of Black and Mexican street gangs. He didn't have truck with either of them. Eddie was someone who was and is incredibly smart and savvy and almost anthropological in his awareness of the world, but is doing it in a totally unpretentious, unself-conscious way, and grows up in South Central Los Angeles all through, the 80s and early 90s. And eventually he's always getting in trouble. He becomes a tagger. He's always spray painting and he's into graffiti and he's always getting in trouble. And his mom is working 2 or 3 jobs at a time and she gets exasperated with him and he gets hauled into juvenile court. And his mom kind of pleading with the judge. This is around 1991. So just around the time that the Salvadoran Civil War is sort of starting to wrap up. The peace accords are being negotiated, none of which Eddie knows at the time, by the way. His mom says to the judge, listen, I want to scare him straight. I don't want to punish him here, but like I've got a brother who lives just outside of San Salvador. I'm going to send him to San Salvador for a year, and he'll see how good he has it here in LA. And this'll scare him straight. This is what we need to do. And so Eddie, all through the sort of late 1980s and early 1990s, is beginning to bump into representatives of what then wasn't even called MS-13. It was called MS. He was seeing at the time the earliest kind of formulation of that gang as Salvadorans were kind of forming their own street gangs in self-defense because they were getting brutalized by some of the local gangs on the streets of Los Angeles. And he's kind of bumping into these guys and keeping his distance because he knows it's bad news. He arrives in El Salvador in 1991 and starts to notice that some of the guys that he has seen and avoided on the streets of South Central Los Angeles are turning up in Soyapango, in San Salvador, in Usulután, because they've been deported. And what's starting to happen is American authorities were cracking down on these gangs, deporting them in mass back to El Salvador at a time when the Salvadoran government didn't have the capacity to deal with the arrival of what were effectively hardened criminals who'd been hardened on the streets of an American city in the prisons of, the state of California. And Eddie kind of experiences this just naturally in the unspooling of his childhood, eventually comes back to the United States, lives his life, is kind of gets his act together. But because of a 1996 law passed by Bill Clinton just, weeks before the 1996 presidential election, he ends up losing his green card status because he and his family eventually had become legal permanent residents. And this law was so draconian that it stripped legal permanent residents of their green card status if they had committed any number of crimes of varying severity in the past that were reclassified by dint of this new law as what were called aggravated felonies. So a drug possession charge that Eddie had been convicted of before the passage of that law now suddenly meant that he was eligible, or that he was no longer eligible for his green card status and was in fact due to be deported. He goes on the lam for many years. Eventually, immigration authorities catch up with him. And he arrives back in El Salvador in 2007 at a time when this gang that he knew when it was kind of a small local outfit has now overtaken not only El Salvador, but elements of the wider region, and is immediately needing to become kind of a survivalist on the streets of San Salvador at a time when that was one of the most dangerous cities in the world as a result of this gang problem that had largely been exported from the United States. So when I met Eddie in 20, I think it was early, maybe like January or February of 2016. He was part of a cottage industry that I was fascinated by, and this is how we met, of English language schools that were cropping up all over El Salvador and Central America that were training people to speak English to be able to work in call centers. Because one of the things that American corporations were recognizing was through the years of increasing mass deportation from the United States, you had populations all across Latin America, but especially in Central America, where people spoke fluent idiomatic American English. They lived in the United States for many years. And as a result of immigration infractions, were getting arrested and deported back to this region. And so a lot of these corporations were outsourcing customer service. I mean, I'm talking about Citibank, hotels.com, any number of businesses that people interact with on a daily basis, to these countries in Central America. And so Eddie, like so many others, the first thing he did when he touched back down in El Salvador with nothing was to get a job in these call centers. And Eddie, being entrepreneurial and smart, realized that actually the path forward for him was to create one of these language schools where he could use the fact that he'd been deported almost as a credential and say, look, study English. If you want to learn English, study it with a native speaker. I'm a native speaker. And that's how we met. And so we sit down to have a beer in San Salvador in 2016. And our first conversation, which was maybe an hour or two, one of the most interesting conversations I've ever had in my life as a journalist, or in my life period. We're just talking about LA in the 1980s. And I had this very particular sensation, which is a sensation that kind of only grew as I got deeper into this book over the following several years, that, I was getting schooled on things about the US when I was abroad, when I was in Central America. That some of the people I was encountering in places like San Salvador or the Western Highlands of Guatemala, they knew more about aspects of my home country than I knew when I had been living here and reporting here. And so, I would challenge, I mean, this is going to sound self-serving, but I would challenge anyone to read Eddie's story or to concern themselves with the details of Eddie's life, say, and not just be riveted by the facts of his life and of who he is and of what he's had to do to build a family. And over the course of learning that story, you learn a lot of the history because Eddie has lived it. But Eddie is not lecturing you about kind of the perils of American foreign policy, and he's not getting into the nitty-gritty of American immigration policy, but he's lived the consequences of those things every day of his life.
So I have a question. There are these dominant narratives of American society, and I grew up in New York, in the New York area, where the Statue of Liberty wasn't just this tourist attraction. It actually was something that was kind of hammered into us as a guiding, foundational idea, at least in the 20th century. This was the story. I later learned that there were a lot of more problems to the story, but the story was, give us, you're tired, you're hungry, and that it was a country of immigrants, and that part of what made the country so great was its capacity to welcome those from different places who had different backgrounds and to integrate them into some, new whole. And that was part of what American identity was. And it was largely a very positive story that frankly glossed over, the suffering and complexity and all sorts of, regulations and many things I later learned about. But my question to you is, I feel like there's an element of the US that retains its connection to that story. And yet the way immigration is talked about now, virtually all kinds of immigration, is a very different narrative. It's one of danger, threat. It's not one that understands people coming in as part of some greater whole, but rather something that presents some form of a threat, either a threat you can mitigate or a threat that you have to stop. I'm just wondering what your thoughts are about these narratives and how your book and your research plays into that.
I mean, that's a great point, particularly now as we're in the throes of the presidential campaign. I mean, we obviously know kind of what the populist demagogue says about these things, or even kind of that general model of politics. But I actually think that it's meaningful and important to not only react against kind of criticisms of immigration and obviously racist attacks against immigrants, but you have to state a positive kind of moral and pragmatic case and historical case for who immigrants are and what they mean to American life. And I've often felt like as the politics on this have gone farther and farther to the right, as the consensus has kind of hardened sort of to the center right. And by that, I mean, the Democrat campaigning for president right now is holding up a bipartisan Senate border bill that is extremely conservative. And we could parse that on the kind of policy merits, and we can kind of talk about why maybe it's so conservative for reasons that aren't just political. But the point is, nowhere in the discussion of what possible solutions are you hearing someone sort of stop listeners and say, wait a second, we first need to just enunciate what values we do believe in. For whatever reason, politically, the kind of conventional wisdom has become that communicates weakness. And so as a result, no one is saying the part about kind of fundamental values or how those values yoked to a kind of pragmatism can define this country and can give us actually a sense of clarity amidst all of the policy confusion. And I've been pretty astounded by how scared mainstream Democrats are, honestly, from talking about that. And I really think that it reflects, a general sense that what's happening at the southern border is kind of too hard to justify or defend. That is, the chaos that people see at the southern border really disproportionately hurts Democrats who are, for whatever reason, seen as being, too soft on the issue. I don't think historically that's been the case. I think they've been quite firm and harsh on these issues. But I also think there have been a few watershed events in the last few years that I didn't engage with in the book because they happened too late, but I think have profoundly changed even the nature of the conversation in America. And what I have kind of foremost in my mind in that regard is what the governor of Texas started to do in the sort of spring and summer of 2022 in busing newly arrived migrants to blue cities and states across the country and doing it without coordination with local and state authorities, very deliberately trying to create a sense of chaos and sow discord and sort of serve it up to, his political opponents that, oh yeah, you try dealing with this. I think that has spooked Democrats across the country. And there was a kind of, to my mind, very identifiable inflection point following that. And the fallout of that in blue cities all across America, in which Democrats are less inclined now to talk about immigration holistically and the need to, be orderly in their approach to the southern border, but also stand up for what it means to increase legal immigration in this country or defend people who came here as children, dreamers, who are undocumented through no fault of their own and so on. That stuff has all been really muted. I was at the DNC in Chicago, and by and large, the only discussion you heard was a discussion on the night in which immigration was talked about most explicitly. You only heard talk about these kind of tough measures being taken by the Biden administration at the southern border. And kind of fascinatingly for me, the first day of the Democratic convention coincided with a very laudable policy, to my mind, that the Biden administration adopted and has since been tied up in court, but which they nevertheless made an attempt to do, which was to create a pathway to citizenship for 500,000 undocumented spouses of U.S. citizens. A noble, important, laudable thing that a presidential administration can do while Congress is deadlocked and dysfunctional. That went into effect, that policy, the first day of the Democratic National Convention, and it wasn't mentioned once. Instead, what was mentioned ad nauseum was this Senate border bill that would have worked and would have tamped down on frivolous asylum claims if only Donald Trump hadn't disrupted it. I mean, that was so much ground is ceded that I really think It alarms me, honestly. It alarms me because I don't think people are having a kind of full enough conversation around the issue.
We have some questions now
Yeah.
from the audience. So from very patient Arnolfo Acedo Jr. It's known that American foreign policy played a role in creating the migration crisis during the 1980s due to its role in supporting one side of the Civil War. By that I mean, must mean Central American wars that you talked about a little bit. What is America doing now to alleviate such effects? And should it be open to receiving asylum seekers who are fleeing gang violence, which is the result of the regional migration during the 1980s? A big part of your book, is there some special uh, 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 provisions or engagement that should accrue to that because of U.S. involvement in the region?
I mean, it's a great question, and part of what's built into that question, but which is worth just sort of highlighting here too, is in 2014, when you have this large number of people fleeing for their lives from Central America, arriving at the southern border and seeking asylum, their asylum claims on the merits, which are very technical and esoteric, based on this statute that was written in 1980 and which has been sort of only slightly sort of updated through jurisprudence in immigration courts, but it's more or less this kind of old, kind of flinty, document that doesn't apply to the world as it's changed over the years. People had a real uphill battle winning their asylum cases because here they were fleeing, say, a gang in El Salvador that controlled every aspect of life in the country. That was effectively a kind of shadow state that dominated people's lives and that you could not outrun if you tried, and everyone had tried. Um, and yet, by the terms of the asylum statute as it was written, a skeptical immigration officer could deny, or immigration judge could deny someone's asylum claim on the grounds that they weren't being persecuted based on criteria related to their identity. And so, what's so painful in looking at the history is in the 1980s, you had people who really, in a textbook way, fit the definition of what asylum was supposed to provide to people. People who were being persecuted based on their identity, whether it was political or personal or so on, by the state, by a repressive state. But what was essentially built into that statute was the idea that the state had to be abusive. And here, fast forward, 20 or 30 years, you had something that was even more powerful in some ways and even more nefarious than the state in these gangs, that the US had a role in spreading all through the region, that technically didn't qualify someone fleeing them for asylum. To my mind, there has not been any systematic effort. To answer the question, no, there has not been a systematic legal effort made on the part of the US government as a form of kind of redress for all of the harm it's done to the wider region. There was a moment, fascinatingly, and this is, a small kind of coda to the earlier history I was describing, all through the 1980s, you had Salvador, at a time when I think it was like maybe 20 or 22% of people seeking asylum were granted it in the mid 1980s. 98 and 99% of Salvadoran and Guatemalan asylum seekers were rejected. And what activists said all through the 1980s was, this feels like discrimination. And what eventually came out was evidence in the form of government documents that the government was systematically discriminating against asylum seekers from these countries. And that led to a legal settlement in 1990 that gave a kind of path for a few 100,000 people whose asylum claims had been denied in the 80s to kind of make another run at regaining their legal footing in the United States. But that is a small form of redress, given the kind of magnitude of what
The
U.S.
famous
involvement
ABC
originally.
case.
The ABC Thornburg
So
litigation.
a question here from Lenny Benson is a kind of
Oh
very
man,
much
that's
related.
an intimidating person to be asking about the ABC case.
No, Jonathan, do you think that the Biden
Yeah.
approval of country-specific humanitarian paroles, this is somewhat related because it's a
Yeah.
TPS system,
Yeah.
right? Is appreciated or can help diffuse the border problems. Texas sued over most of these parole programs, but didn't challenge parole for Ukrainians. I would love to hear your comment on the approach of a nation-by-nation pathway to temporary admission that could lead to more organized asylum seeking.
Well, to my mind, I'm grateful for the question because to my mind, that's been kind of the one bright spot in the Biden administration's general approach to sort of the border and asylum issues generally, which is that at a certain point, and the Biden administration obviously got kind of mired in Trump era policies that it struggled to wind down or to sufficiently separate itself from. But in early 2023, and Lenny Benson obviously knows this as well as anyone, but for those who aren't read into this particular policy, the Biden administration introduced a parole program for migrants from Haiti, Venezuela, Cuba, and Nicaragua. I've said it out of order because it's called the CHNV program. And essentially, the idea of this parole program, which I thought was quite smart and novel, was to recognize the fact that immigration from these countries was really increasing at what, by the standards of these countries, was a kind of astronomical rate. And people from these four countries were making up a preponderant number of those arriving at the southern border. And so rather than kind of dealing with a kind of inevitable flow of people out of these countries for all kinds of reasons. I mean, you had, political repression in Cuba and Nicaragua. You have the collapse of the state in Venezuela at a scale that we've really never seen in the hemisphere. Haiti has been mired in political violence and still hasn't even recovered from the 2010 earthquake and so on. People are going to be leaving these countries out of desperation in large numbers. And rather than dealing with their arrival at the southern border, which is, tends to be messy and inhumane and chaotic, the Biden administration thought, okay, we can find a way of creating a more orderly arrival for people from these countries. And so what it did was it granted through this parole program, 30,000 slots to migrants from these four countries every month. And one of the most immediate effects you started to see at the southern border was that the people from these four countries arriving at the southern border dropped by 90%. That's a very significant policy consequence. When I spoke to and speak to people, for example, at DHS, one of the things that's surprising in my day-to-day reporting is, you tend to assume that people who work, say, for ICE or Border Patrol or Customs and Border Protection are going to kind of be knee-jerk, tough enforcement guys. A lot of them are pragmatic and end up saying surprising things because they're trying to basically perform triage along the border. And a number of them, with different kind of personal political perspectives, really swore by this parole program as really one of the few sensible ways to deal with something that was hemispheric and international, and that the US couldn't single-handedly sort of stop or correct for in any immediate way. So I actually thought that those parole programs were incredibly novel and interesting. And of course, what necessitated policies like these is the fact that, there's going to be no form of intervention from Congress at all. And so the executive is increasingly having to find creative ways of managing not just immigration generally, but the southern border specifically, without its kind of arsenal of usual tools. And that includes, by the way, funds and basic resources. Because what started to happen all through 2023 was that the Republican House essentially refused to respond to the Biden administration's request for more money, to hire more agents and to invest in more detention space and so on. And so the Biden administration really had its back up against a wall. And I thought that parole program was a success. As far as I know, and I've been a little bit whipped around lately by news, that program, unlike some of the other parole programs, like, for example, for spouses that we mentioned earlier, has actually withstood some of the initial legal challenges. Lately, there was a setback for this parole program that had to do with, sponsors and the possibility of there being fraud among sponsors, which the administration claims to have corrected. But I thought this was a kind of a major thing. And what's been pretty interesting to see lately has been the way in which Republicans, in the context of the election, are trying to hold up this parole program as proof of how the Biden administration has embraced kind of illegal action. And that came up when the Secretary of Homeland Security was impeached. The biggest argument that was used against him, and I went to those hearings, and they were wacky hearings, the argument that kept coming up from one House Republican after another who voted to impeach Mayorkas was, he basically presided over a parole program in which the US government kind of knowingly waved people through, which of course is a misrepresentation of how the policy worked. It's a kind of deliberate misconstrual of the circumstances that forced the administration to taking this kind of policy action. But then, you fast forward to, for example, the recent events in Springfield, Ohio, and the way that the Republican ticket has kind of fomented fear and confusion and all kinds of horrible racist tropes around Haitian, immigrants living legally in Springfield and elsewhere. One of the things that J.D. Vance recently said that really made my sort of my hair stand up on end was, I'm going to continue to refer to these legal immigrants as illegal because we don't recognize the legitimacy of the policies that the Biden administration used to bring them here, which is an extraordinarily scary, dangerous game, to say nothing of obviously the associated racism of it and so on. But I thought this kind of country by country parole style approach represented under the circumstances pretty creative thinking.
So another question from Stella Rouse, who is the director of the Hispanic Research Center here at ASU. This is related because it talks about sort of coming up with ways to understand the categories of people who come seeking assistance. So how do you assess the issue of climate migration, both generally and also in relationship to the regions that you've been focusing on? How do we make sense of those sort of actions, which are no doubt going to increase in the future? And what is that? How do we process that in those folks who cross the border?
Yeah, I mean, it's a profound question. And initially my initial plan for the book was actually to structure it in such a way that, and this did not end up working, but was to structure it in such a way that a reader would be taken through the kind of initial promise of the 1980 Refugee Act, its kind of immediate subversion in the 1980s, its kind of administrative dysfunction, and it's being starved of resources in the 1990s and early 2000s, and then the kind of renewal of a crisis, insofar as large numbers of Central Americans were showing up seeking asylum in the mid to late 2010s, and the U.S. government didn't have a response to it. And then I was going to sort of end with all of the ways in which the Trump administration tried to, pretty much end asylum as we knew it. And then I was going to sort of try to pan out onto the reality of climate migration, because it's impossible to do work. I mean, you can hear, even as I'm summarizing it, why it would just make for a terrible structural approach to a book. But my point was, here was the promise of asylum as it existed, not even working the way it was meant to. And then you take a population of people who are being uprooted by climate change, who do not have a kind of clear legal avenue through the asylum system because they're not being persecuted. That's just not what it is, which doesn't mean that their desperation or the urgency of their flight is any less real. But they just don't have a kind of legal category to sort themselves in. And so, the way I was going to try to kind of pose this current moment in that regard was, well, what do we do with people whose plight and whose desperation are totally predictable given what we know about climate change, but who have no real chances in the kind of, sort of wizened legal landscape as it exists to actually get relief in the US. As far as I know, there has been no progress made at a governmental level, at a lawmaking level, for thinking that through. I know really smart people, at universities and at legal clinics have been thinking through different kind of visa categories for people who are being uprooted as a consequence of climate change. I think there are very promising ways to do that, whether it's creating, it's expanding existing visa categories for people in regions that are directly affected by climate change, or even identifying people who are being uprooted by climate change as a discrete population that deserves to have some form of legal avenue to come and work or live in the United States. It's an acute problem, obviously, all through Central America. And I just, the dynamics of how politics kind of route this policy conversation, this is something that I actually think it's a tragedy that we're not discussing at the highest levels of government. But that's just not what the reality is right now. Right now, the reality has been for those in government tamp down perceptions of chaos at the southern border because the electoral consequences are going to be dire. And if Trump wins, a conversation like this about climate migration is out the window. If Harris wins, I don't know, maybe there's a chance to sort of force this conversation more systematically. But a lot of the reporting I did in the Western Highlands in like 2000 of Guatemala in 2018, I guess late 2018, early 2019, which really shaped my sense of all of the ways in which people were being forced to leave because of the consequences of climate change. A lot of what motivated that for me was during the summer of the family separation crisis, the southern border, kind of in let's say May, June, July 2018. I was meeting one after another of indigenous Guatemalans from specific communities in the Western Highlands. And I was primarily reporting around the El Paso Juarez border. And it was immediately striking. I mean, you couldn't talk to people and not notice how many were coming from a specific place and all saying more or less the same thing, which was, we're starving to death. And when I arrived in some of these areas several months later, people explained to me very specifically how the rain that they were expecting for their crops that was meant to come in April of 2018 came 2 months later. And as a result, their livelihoods were wiped out. And that coincided specifically with the dynamics that I was seeing in May and June 2018 in places like El Paso. I mean, you cannot engage in these issues and not come face to face with the reality of climate change. And I'm very concerned that just right now politically there hasn't been the kind of bandwidth for people to think about it, but there's no avoiding it.
Well, that is one of the real takeaways of all the issues with U.S. and immigration policy, that the near complete failure to address issues that are widely recognized as essential to our country now and in the future. I just want to thank you so much for joining us, and thank everybody who spent part of the evening. We look forward to seeing you again, and everybody have a good night.
Thanks so much.